and welcome to the Compact podcast. Today we'll be discussing the political implications of the death of the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash this week. President Biden's new tariffs on electric vehicles, designed to protect America from Chinese encroachment into the industry. And finally, the announcement of the bankruptcy of the US seafood chain, Red Lobster, due perhaps, at least in part, to its ultimate endless shrimp promotion last autumn. I'm your host, Nina Power, and I'm joined today by Matthew Schmitz and Geoff Shullenberger. So, for those who oppose the hardline Iranian leader, Raisi's death, understood to be accidental, was an unexpected bonus. He stands accused by the UN of various crimes against humanity over multiple decades, among which overseeing the jailing, torture, and death of many Iranians, and there were reports of celebrations in the country. Iran also recently launched a missile and drone attack on Israel. What do we think will happen inside and outside of the country now?
Well, Sarab Amari, our Iranian correspondent, isn't with us. To my knowledge, that has no connection with the recent helicopter crash in that country. Nor, I believe, was the helicopter crash related, though we're waiting for more data to DEI and air traffic control. Waiting for more updates on that. It's not easy for me to engage in criminology about the country. I guess the one most notable controversy we've seen is just among Western media about how Western governments should respond to this, whether they should respond with expressions of condolence or with none. And I think it just shows the ambiguous position that a lot of Western countries have towards Iran, including to a great degree the United States itself. There was an attempted pivot under the Obama administration to thaw relations with Iran. They once again cooled under Trump, and Biden has seemingly tried to have it both ways. So we're neither able seemingly to bring Iran into the system of Western aligned powers, nor are we really willing to treat them as an enemy. So I think a lot of the controversy and confusion around the country stems from that fact of really trying to have it both ways under our current president.
Yeah, it's not a area where I feel I have a great deal of expertise to offer, but it was interesting, first of all, to note the reaction to it. Really, after the helicopter was reported missing, it was kind of, there were many references to sort of, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So everybody's kind of waiting for some event that will, finally unleash World War III, or at least a kind of full-scale regional conflagration in the Middle East. And so far, it would seem that that those prognoses were incorrect. The government has clearly stated that it was an accident, regardless of what I mean, it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that there was some sort of foul play involved here, but most of the evidence seems to point to that, and that seems to be the line, certainly, that Iran's government is going with. And so, regardless of how, of how this turns out, it seems like another instance of, people are kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and each time it turns out not to lead to the huge escalation and explosion that is expected. So it was interesting to see that cycle play out again over the sort of 24 hours or so. I mean, another thing that's kind of striking about it is it's, we hear a great deal about sort of, emerging multipolarity and, Iran kind of increasingly flexing its muscles, through its various proxy forces, perhaps most notably the Houthis in Yemen being able to significantly reduce shipping through the Suez Canal, is quite a feat on the part of the sort of Iran aligned axis of resistance, as it's called, and suggests a kind of rising power flexing its muscles. And there are other kind of interesting things, like the fact that Iran actually supplies Russia with drones for use in Ukraine. So there's a kind of leveling of the playing field. A lot of is seems to be what's apparent a lot of the time, and an inability of the United States to be able to rein in this kind of pesky rising. Although also a sort of ambivalence from the United States about how exactly to deal with Iran. Obviously, there's been a significant faction within the foreign policy apparatus that's pushed a more dovish line towards Iran. But in any case, an inability to kind of keep this whole situation under wraps. But then, an incident like this is, on one level, just quite, seems quite humiliating if it is indeed essentially an accident. And by most accounts would seem to have to do with the extremely poor aviation infrastructure, old aircraft, difficulty of obtaining parts, partly due to sanctions. And so, that this helicopter dated back to like the 70s. And so, it seems to kind of complicate this narrative that Iran is this like unstoppable rising power. If it's, it's essentially head of state is dies in an accident. That's not an indication of a country that's really particularly functional or able to really contest. I mean, it can sort of contest. It's as with as many times in history. Sort of world powers can often be get sort of drawn into quagmires through effective guerrilla tactics. But that's another question than whether Iran as a kind of nation state is actually able to function as a sort of rising regional power. And this incident seems to sort of call that into question, right? If it's not able to maintain the safety of its own top leadership, then that's not a particularly that's not a that doesn't seem to bespeak a particularly kind of impressive situation as far as the the country's ability to function on a basic level. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's and so it I think speaks to kind of various ambiguities about the sort of shift towards a kind of multipolarity, where what you have is on one hand a weakening of the United States and its ability to do things like maintain shipping through the Suez Canal. At the same time, you have these sort of rising powers, which are in their own ways, still quite weak and dysfunctional, and so don't really pose as robust of a threat as is often claimed. And so I suppose going back to the point about why we're not seeing escalation yet, and hopefully we'll not. It would seem that the ability of Iran to actually, if this incident is anything to go by, to it would clearly be disastrous for the U.S. for reasons that we've already seen in recent history, to engage militarily with Iran. But the idea that Iran is, can kind of confidently go into a war with the, sort of premier world power, even in its current kind of weakened state, it seems quite fantastical. And if it's not able to kind of maintain the security of its own top personnel, then that would seem to suggest it's in a weaker position than some sort of boosters of sort of multipolarity might claim. So those are just some sort of stray speculative remarks, but it does seem indicative of where we are and where we are not at this historical juncture as far as the geopolitical situation goes.
Yeah, I think the more pressing issue for Iran is clearly its kind of popular division. I mean, there have been protests in Iran for decades at this point, whether it's student protests or color revolution type protests. More recently, we've seen the hijab protests. I've had the fortune of visiting Iran a couple of times, albeit 20 or so years ago. It's extremely beautiful and proud country. It's a magnificent place, and the the division between the people is genuinely serious. There are a lot of people who are pro-regime, and there are a lot of people who are against. It's completely riven, and as we've seen from the kind of images of protests over the years, the truth will out, I suppose, in the elections, which they have to call following this death. But the election turnout has been very, very low in recent years, indicating a kind of apathy or a sort of indifference or maybe a kind of depressed acceptance of the situation. And there's no doubt that the regime has become more and more hardline over the years since the revolution in '79, which saw the killing actually of a lot of leftists. So there aren't really socialist pressures. I mean, Iranian history in the 20th century is extremely complicated, but a lot of it is in response really to forms of exploitation and asset theft by companies like the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now BP, and the installation of the Shah, the attempt at kind of rapid westernization, and then the kind of backlash against that on the part of the Iranian people in a coalition of leftists and Islamists. And obviously the Islamists won out, and they're continuing to behave in, we have to say, authoritarian ways, in ways that are killing Iranians, locking them up, torturing them, and so on. Um, I think diplomatically there could be an opening here, but one can also understand very well a deep suspicion towards the West. Anyone who comes talking of human rights and bringing color revolutions to the country, I think it's a really, really difficult situation for people in the country who oppose the current regime, who run the risk of being accused of being puppets of Western forces when they are anything but. But this is the dilemma I think people in Iran face at the moment. Okay, so moving on, back to the States. This week, President Biden initiated a series of heavy new tariffs against low price electrical vehicles made in China, which has a much lower labor and raw material cost. In March, this was the topic that set off the media frenzy around Trump's remarks about a bloodbath in the US car industry if China succeeded in assembling these vehicles in Mexican plants, the context for which was analysed at the time by our own Matthew Schmitz. So, what are the details of these new tariffs and how do they relate to the forthcoming election?
The tariffs focus, first of all, on electric vehicles, not only the ones made in China, but also the batteries that are relied on to make them here. Uh, China is farther ahead of the U.S. in electric vehicle battery production. Certain American companies are trying to catch up or exceed China, but have failed to do so. And Biden's also raised tariffs on solar cells, steel, aluminum, and certain kinds of medical equipment. I think, Nina, in your introduction to the segment, you got at the heart of a big question for anyone trying to analyze our emerging tariff regime as we move into this really bipartisan support of trade measures of this type. Is there a simple convergence between the Republicans and the Democrats on this, or is there a certain difference? Right now, I do see a lot of convergence, but it's possible to identify, say, at least two areas in which the approach of the Democratic and Republican parties is likely to diverge. One would be multilateralism, and I would say especially respect for European concerns. I think you're likely to see in the Democratic Party a more solicitous respect for global trade institutions and their rules, and a keener interest in the concerns of European partners. We've seen on NATO and security issues that the Trump administration is more apt to demand that Europeans do their part, pay their dues, whereas the Democratic Party has tended to place fewer demands on our European allies and security measures. I think it's reasonable to suppose that the Republican Party is also going to try to drive a harder bargain with European nations. When Biden came into office, he removed some of the retaliatory trade measures that Trump had imposed on European nations on certain goods. So Biden took a more pro-European stance than Trump had done. And in the other area where I think you're likely to see a difference between the Republican and Democratic approaches to tariff imposition is on green energy. And here, I don't think that the difference is completely clear yet. Bob Lighthizer, Trump's trade advisor, has supported the notion that we should be factoring carbon costs into tariff imposition. So we see that the GOP can take green concerns into account when it fits with its broader agenda of onshoring American manufacturing. There are good reasons to think that there are very high carbon costs to these vehicles or batteries that are manufactured overseas. Environmental regulations are, as a rule, looser in China. And so the GOP has been willing to embrace certain green notions in advancing trade restrictions. But on the whole, Trump in his campaign rhetoric, and this reflects the priorities of the GOP more broadly, has described the green transition as a transition to hell. The GOP as a political bloc is unenthusiastic about electric vehicles. Trump says, if you want an electric vehicle, buy it. But he's floated the idea of removing the $7,500 subsidy for purchase of green vehicles, so on and so forth. So I think you're likely to see the GOP support green ideas where it's seen as helping onshore American manufacturing, or where it's helping, really where it's just putting China or other competitors at a disadvantage. But I think what you're going to see from the Democratic Party is a more comprehensive effort to reshape the market so as to favor a green transition through things like that $7,500 subsidy for purchasing an electronic vehicle. And the GOP is going to be more neutral between electric vehicles and combustion engine vehicles. So I think we're still waiting to see the differences between the two approaches. And it's probably right that commentators have so far focused on the fact of convergence between the economic approaches of the two parties. But I don't for a moment believe that they're going to take the same approach to tariffs. Just because you have, tariffs can be employed toward different ends. They can be employed for the sake of national security and promoting the single earner family model, right? You could think of it in that way and try to advance it. And, our more economically liberal friends would point out the difficulties of doing that. Fine. Then you can have a different version of what your market interventions are supposed to promote, and that would be the green transition, really the Green New Deal. And there are important divergences between those two models. And I do think we're going to, in a couple of years or 5 years from now, begin talking more about how, even though we've arguably moved beyond a neoliberal era where both parties support more laissez-faire doctrines, and they've converged on a new kind of post-neoliberal approach, they still really do have different priorities in mind. And they may be using similar tools, but they're using those tools toward different ends.
Geoff, do you want to intervene on the electric vehicles? I'm kind of curious, what percentage of Americans sort of have one, to be honest, or how popular they are. I mean, I take Matthew's point about the political divergence and the reasons why one might support or not support them, and any concerns people might have about a Green New Deal, or we have net zero and all of these kinds of proposals over here as well. But I'm just wondering, I mean, it's kind of complicated, isn't it? Because Elon Musk, who's not really a hero of the democratic left, is obviously one of the major manufacturers, if not the major manufacturer of electrical vehicles, right? So people have Teslas, but don't support Musk.
Well, I mean, there are many, there are many layers of irony there because, of course, now Musk will kind of go on these tirades on Twitter about how, about communism and socialism, where which is defined in classic sort of Reaganite manner as like any kind of government intervention in the economy whatsoever. But of course, his entire fortune is based on particularly the subsidies that were introduced during the Obama era, in California and nationwide, are really why Tesla blew up. I mean, it couldn't have done so without a huge amount of government intervention, and so he basically owes a large part of his fortune to these kind of green policies. And yeah, I mean, certainly it's look, when you're in the suburbs of around New York City, if you go to like um the sort of shopping plaza where there's like Starbucks and things like that, there will be a lot of Tesla charging stations. In some neighborhoods of Brooklyn, I've seen Tesla charging state or electric vehicle charging stations start springing up, and in fact, there are like certain parking spaces that are now reserved for them, which I find annoying because I'm always looking for parking. But yeah, so I mean, I think essentially it's primarily a kind of status symbol of quite affluent people. You see quite a few of them in the Bay Area. I think the highest concentration of Teslas you see is like in and around San Francisco. Just a kind of remark that I still find baffling, that people think that electric vehicles are uh, automatically green without considering the question of where the electricity is coming from. And so I think that just remains kind of a weird dimension of all of this, that and there is kind of this class aspect of it, right? Where, clearly whatever these policies are, they largely benefit people who, can afford these quite expensive vehicles, and they, primarily redound, not to the benefit of average people. Who, I mean, I can't afford to buy a new car. I'm my car is 20 years old. It's a good Toyota. It's very fuel efficient. And I've read things that suggest that holding on to a car, holding on to like a good fuel efficient car, in terms of its whatever, it's very difficult to calculate these things, but in terms of its overall sort of carbon impact, is actually far greener than buying a new electric vehicle, if you calculate it over the
Yeah,
life of the
it makes.
vehicle.
I'll just interrupt you for only a moment because I want to read something that goes to support your point. I mean, Trump on the campaign trail has been playing up this kind of class angle of the electric vehicle subsidies. So, in a rally on May 1st, he told rally goers, Crooked Joe is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to give $7,500 tax credits to rich people who buy electric cars. So, that's the narrative Trump is pushing, and uh,
Seems
maybe
true.
there's maybe there's some rejoinders to that, but I think it probably resonates with a bunch of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly resonates on some level with me, just because, as I said, I think that there are all sorts of questions about electric vehicles. One being, what's the cost um, of producing them, and that is itself something that generates a certain amount of carbon, and then also what is the source of the electricity. I mean, in New York State, we've gone towards a more carbon intensive energy mix, because the nuclear reactor at Indian Point was shut down a year or two ago, after a long kind of campaign spearheaded by environmental organizations. And so what that means is actually New York State is, less is using more oil and gas for its sort of electrical grid than it was previously. And so, what that means is, well, if you're charging your car in New York State, then that's then like the fact that there aren't emissions coming out of the tailpipe doesn't mean that it's not um, you know generating energy through burning fossil fuels. So it all seems like a very I think there are many different dimensions of this whole thing, but the immediate impact, as far as I can tell, is probably not going to be great for um, people who can't afford these vehicles. So, and it's also just inconvenient. I mean, the infrastructure doesn't exist yet. Um, it like charging them is complicated. Um, it's so yeah. It seems like and yeah, I mean, just turning back to and it's something that we published that doesn't discuss this directly, but it seems indicative of something that Musal Garvey wrote for us about the Democrats kind of becoming the party of the knowledge economy professional class, and that these are both these are policy preferences that express the values and consumer preferences of a class that happens to have an outsized influence within the Democratic coalition. And so that just seems kind of obvious. And then it's dressed up in this kind of messianic rhetoric around climate that just doesn't seem very reality based, for the simple reasons I gave, which is that until you're figuring out how you're going to decarbonize the production of electricity at the source, then it just kind of shifts the sort of fossil fuel burning to a different location. So it's all and it does have to do with geopolitical and economic competition with China, which clearly is for its own reasons that don't have to do that aren't driven by the same things, is investing heavily in this industry and kind of betting on it. And so to some extent that creates another impetus for it and kind of logic that's going to be pursued here. So I don't know exactly, so I think that does add another dimension to the whole situation, but exactly how that plays out remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish on this point, I mean, I can't drive, obviously, um, but I'm just looking up the figures in the UK, and only 7% of cars are currently electric in my country. But the government are planning by 2050 to make all cars electric or zero emission. For these net zero targets. And from 2035, it's apparently going to be illegal to sell new petrol and diesel cars. But this seems wildly unrealistic, frankly, for all of the reasons that you've both mentioned. So I'm not convinced that this is going to solve anything, least of all the larger electrical or energetic problem that Geoff is alluding to. So finally, this week, Red Lobster, an eatery with which I am not familiar, but is apparently a popular chain with branches in more than 20 states of America, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. What are the cultural implications of this sad loss for the country?
Well, let's just admit there's something comical about Red Lobster closing because of their ultimate endless shrimp deal. Americans just absolutely destroying the hope for profits of these private equity firms who had taken a stake in Red Lobster and the Thai food conglomerate that was backing it. I've never been to a Red Lobster, but I would often drive by them, and they are associated with a particular kind of American dining that I think is notable just as a sociological fact. It's positioned somewhere between a real upscale restaurant and a fast food place. Um, I think Red Lobster had originally launched as a kind of cocktail lounge, but then became this sort of upper end family friendly dining option, maybe somewhat equivalent to an Applebee's, or yeah, I'm not sure exactly how the market segmentation works, but something like that. So its death, and particularly its death through this kind of bottomless brunch option, I think indicates, why not, let's say it, the death of the American middle class. Right? Because this kind of middling option, has been superseded by maybe the rise of other fast food chains or fast casual options. Rising inflation has made people much more sensitive to their expenses, in terms of dining out. And if they feel that there's a really good deal they can get somewhere, they're going to really hit that deal hard. Uh, one book I think of in this connection is Mildred Pierce, a novel by James M. Cain, the writer of thrillers. Uh, I think better known for The Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity, both made into classic noir films. Mildred Pierce is also an excellent novel. It was also made into a film, which pulps it up a bit. But what's notable about Mildred Pierce, in sociological terms, is that it tracks the rise of American uh, restaurant culture, which was a very novel thing at one point in the 20th century. People ate at home unless you were on the road, kind of traveling salesman or something. You were going to eat in your home. Uh, Eating out used to be much less common, and eating out was a sign, in part, of rising affluence. It was also a sign of, as indicated by the title of Mildred Pierce, a sign of kind of increasing independence for American women and increasing freedom in the ways that American families live their lives. So you didn't have to have that kind of classic scene of the patriarch presiding at the head of the table over a meal that the wife had prepared for the well scrubbed and well dressed children. Uh, we briefly gave up on that model of eating out during the pandemic. So there was a few months when all liquor stores were closed in the country and no one could eat out, and it was a sort of return to Prohibition era America. Uh, but maybe what we're seeing is the removal of a certain kind of middle segment of restaurants.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting here also Malcolm Chayuna wrote a piece for us last year called Why Fast Food Isn't Cheap Anymore. And, it kind of tracked this widely observed phenomena that, fast food places are. I mean, I saw somebody post the other day, like, this wasn't from a fast food place, but from some like brew pub kind of thing. And it was like, you know, uh, a beer and a cheeseburger for, $25 or something like that. And somebody posted that and was like, this is supposed to be a deal. Like, this is supposed to be cheap. But indeed, that is kind of, the reality of inflation. And these, fast food prices have really significantly increased in recent years. So I don't know, Red Lobster, as you said, is kind of in that middle tier, along with Olive Garden and places like that. Is a place you go out to eat, not necessarily takeout. And it does, yeah, it has that kind of suburban, exurban kind of middle class demographic. But the other thing that's notable about it is lobster here, as well as things like shrimp being, in a sense, a kind of luxury, a sort of, becoming a kind of accessible luxury, right? Lobster, remains a kind of a delicacy. It's that you can only uh, catch lobster in certain parts of the country. So this also speaks to kind of the functioning of supply chains, cold storage, the ability to transport, live lobsters to, places very far from the ocean. And so it speaks to the kind of civilizational integration of late 20th century North America, right? That you could show up in Des Moines, go to a Red Lobster, and have lobster straight out of the tank. This it says something about the things that are that American civilization kind of afforded the middle class, as Matthew is suggesting, in the height of sort of late 20th century prosperity, and that this kind of luxurious product could become accessible for middle class people anywhere in the country, at least as an occasional treat. And so, I think this is symbolic not just of the demise of the middle class, but of the demise of this kind of accessible luxury kind of model of things that was made possible, as Malcolm discusses in his piece, by these incredibly sophisticated kind of logistical and supply chain innovations that made it possible to have a constant supply of lobsters in suburban Phoenix or wherever, as far as possible, from where they were harvested. And so, yeah, I mean, I really think, my grandmother was, lived in Dayton, Ohio, was very fond of lobster, but she, although interestingly, she was also kind of allergic to shellfish, so she shouldn't really have eaten them at all. But she just loved enjoying lobster. But she actually maintained from her earlier life this idea, because she had, grown up, born and bred in Dayton, Ohio, had never eaten lobster until she went to Maine in her, when she was in her 20s or something like that. And it was this revelatory experience. And she continued to, even though Red Lobster existed where she lived, she continued to reserve it as this thing she would only do when she was visiting the East Coast. And, when I visited her, we would drive by a Red Lobster and say, "Hey, Grandma, you could go get a lobster there anytime if you wanted." And she would say, "No, no, no, no. I want to get it close to the source." So, that was kind of this, because she still grew up in the era when it would have been inconceivable to obtain lobster, like where she was from. And so she decided she wanted to keep it that way, and maintain the sense of it as a rare delicacy. But in any case, so it does make me think of that, and my grandmother's refusal to go to Red Lobster. But overall, it I think it really does say a lot about where America is today. So I'm glad we had the chance to discuss it.
A happy note for lobsters everywhere, a sad note for the American dream. And with that, I'd like to thank Matthew, Geoff, and Stephen, our producer. Don't forget to subscribe at compactmag.com if you haven't already. And thank you for listening.